The storm had followed Erin Rivera all the way from London, as though even the weather conspired to remind her of her diminished circumstances. Rain lashed the windows of the hired coach as it lurched up the endless drive to Montford House, and when she finally stepped down into the courtyard, mud claimed her worn half-boots immediately. The great house loomed above her, all cold stone and blazing windows that seemed to emphasize rather than welcome. A footman with carefully cultivated blankness admitted her, his gaze skating over her damp travelling cloak with the briefest flicker of disdain. The entrance hall was a cathedral of marble and gilt, designed to humble. Water dripped from Erin's hem to form an ever-widening puddle at her feet on the black and white checkerboard floor. She resisted the urge to step aside from it. Let them see what desperation looked like. Miss Rivera. The voice came from the shadows of the grand staircase, and despite herself, Erin's breath caught. The Duke of Montford descended with the unhurried precision of a man who had never been kept waiting in his life. He was younger than she'd expected, perhaps 35, and handsome in the severe way of classical statuary, all clean lines and cold perfection. His dark hair was swept back from a high forehead, his jaw as uncompromising as the rest of him. But it was his eyes that arrested her, grey as winter ice, and just as welcoming. He stopped 3 steps from the bottom, looking down at her. "You're late." "The storm, Your Grace." "The roads are the same roads everyone must travel." He descended the final steps, circling her slowly. "Lady Eloin requires structure. Discipline. She has driven away for governesses in 18 months. For women with impeccable references who departed in tears or fury." He recited a schedule that would have broken a military cadet: rise at 7, lessons until noon, supervised exercise, afternoon studies, needlework, supper in the nursery, bed at 8. No deviation. No exceptions. "Your Grace, forgive me, but that leaves no time for..." "For what, Miss Rivera? Play? Frivolity?" His eyebrows rose a fraction. "My daughter is Lady Eloin Coon, and she will be raised accordingly." "She's 6 years old," Erin said quietly. The temperature in the entrance hall seemed to drop 10 degrees. "I am aware of my daughter's age. What I require is your awareness of your position. You will not coddle her. You will not indulge her tantrums. You will break her of her willfulness, or you will join the long line of failures who preceded you." Erin thought of her father's estate, of the foreclosure notice that would arrive in 3 months. She thought of the workhouse awaiting impoverished gentlewomen with no prospects. But she also thought of a child, motherless, lonely, subjected to this man's icebound philosophy. "What you're describing isn't a child, Your Grace. It's a small soldier." His eyes narrowed. "I did not invite you here to debate philosophy. I could hire 50 like you before the week is out." The words crystallized something inside her. Desperation had its limits. "Then do it," she said quietly, and turned toward the door. "Miss Rivera." The command in his voice stopped her. "Where do you think you're going?" "Back to London. I'd rather brave a storm than stay where I'm not wanted. I offered you a position. You offered me the chance to be treated as something less than human." She met his winter ice gaze. "I decline." Silence fell between them, broken only by rain against windows and the steady drip of water onto marble. Then, impossibly, the Duke's mouth twitched, not quite a smile, but something other than ice. "1 month," he said abruptly. "A trial period. Prove your methods work, or leave without reference." It was terrible terms. But it was all she had. "Agreed," Erin said, sealing her fate. The storm had followed Erin Rivera all the way from London, as though even the weather conspired to remind her of her diminished circumstances. Rain lashed the windows of the hired coach as it lurched up the endless drive to Montford House, and when she finally stepped down into the courtyard, mud claimed her worn half-boots immediately. The great house loomed above her, all cold stone and blazing windows that seemed to emphasize rather than welcome. A footman with carefully cultivated blankness admitted her, his gaze skating over her damp travelling cloak with the briefest flicker of disdain. The entrance hall was a cathedral of marble and gilt, designed to humble. Water dripped from Erin's hem to form an ever-widening puddle at her feet on the black and white checkerboard floor. She resisted the urge to step aside from it. Let them see what desperation looked like. Miss Rivera. The voice came from the shadows of the grand staircase, and despite herself, Erin's breath caught. The Duke of Montford descended with the unhurried precision of a man who had never been kept waiting in his life. He was younger than she'd expected, perhaps 35, and handsome in the severe way of classical statuary, all clean lines and cold perfection. His dark hair was swept back from a high forehead, his jaw as uncompromising as the rest of him. But it was his eyes that arrested her, grey as winter ice, and just as welcoming. He stopped 3 steps from the bottom, looking down at her. "You're late." "The storm, Your Grace." "The roads are the same roads everyone must travel." He descended the final steps, circling her slowly. "Lady Eloin requires structure. Discipline. She has driven away for governesses in 18 months. For women with impeccable references who departed in tears or fury." He recited a schedule that would have broken a military cadet: rise at 7, lessons until noon, supervised exercise, afternoon studies, needlework, supper in the nursery, bed at 8. No deviation. No exceptions. "Your Grace, forgive me, but that leaves no time for..." "For what, Miss Rivera? Play? Frivolity?" His eyebrows rose a fraction. "My daughter is Lady Eloin Coon, and she will be raised accordingly." "She's 6 years old," Erin said quietly. The temperature in the entrance hall seemed to drop 10 degrees. "I am aware of my daughter's age. What I require is your awareness of your position. You will not coddle her. You will not indulge her tantrums. You will break her of her willfulness, or you will join the long line of failures who preceded you." He paused, retrieving a folded document from his coat. "The compensation is £15 per annum, paid quarterly. Standard for such positions." Erin's breath stopped. £15. Her father's estate required £40 immediately to forestall foreclosure, and another 30 by year's end to clear the remaining debts. Even living as frugally as a nun, even sending every farthing home, she would fail. The mathematics were brutal and inescapable. "Your Grace, I was given to understand the salary would be negotiable upon demonstration of competence," he finished coldly. "You have no references, Miss Rivera. No prior experience with children of quality. You come to me as a charity case, and I am offering you employment when most would show you the door." His winter eyes held hers. £15 is generous under the circumstances. It wasn't generous. It was insulting. It was calculated to remind her of her powerlessness. Erin thought of her father's estate, of the foreclosure notice that would arrive in 3 months. She thought of the workhouse awaiting impoverished gentlewomen with no prospects. But she also thought of a child, motherless, lonely, subjected to this man's icebound philosophy. "What you're describing isn't a child, Your Grace. It's a small soldier." His eyes narrowed. "I did not invite you here to debate philosophy. I could hire 50 like you before the week is out." The words crystallized something inside her. Desperation had its limits. "Then do it," she said quietly, and turned toward the door. "Miss Rivera." The command in his voice stopped her. "Where do you think you're going?" "Back to London. I'd rather brave a storm than stay where I'm not wanted. I offered you a position. You offered me the chance to be treated as something less than human." She met his winter ice gaze. "I decline." Silence fell between them, broken only by rain against windows and the steady drip of water onto marble. Then, impossibly, the Duke's mouth twitched, not quite a smile, but something other than ice. "1 month," he said abruptly. A trial period. Prove your methods work, and we'll discuss terms. Fail, and you leave without reference. It was terrible terms. But it was all she had. Agreed, Erin said, sealing her fate. The nursery occupied the entire third floor of the east wing, as far from the Duke's apartments as geography would allow. Erin climbed the servant stairs at dawn, her borrowed dress still damp at the hem, her stomach tight with apprehension. The housekeeper, Mrs. Fairchild, had given her the briefest of orientations the night before, Lady Eloin's rooms, the schedule, and a warning delivered in hushed tones that the child was more trouble than she's worth, miss, and that's God's truth. Erin didn't believe in children who were more trouble than they were worth. She believed in children who were hurting. The nursery door stood ajar, and she paused in the corridor, listening. Silence. Not the comfortable silence of a child at play, but the heavy, watchful silence of someone who had learned to make herself small. She knocked softly and entered. The room was beautiful in the way museums were beautiful, meant to be admired, not lived in. Pale blue wallpaper decorated with silver songbirds. A miniature writing desk positioned just so beneath the window. Shelves lined with books arranged by height, their spines uncracked. A rocking horse in the corner that looked as though it had never been ridden. Everything perfect. Everything lifeless. And in the center of it all, perched on the edge of an enormous canopied bed, sat Lady Eloin Coon. She was a tiny thing, all dark curls and enormous grey eyes, her father's eyes, Erin realized with a pang. She wore a white morning dress with enough ribbons and lace to outfit 3 children, and her small hands were folded precisely in her lap. She didn't move when Erin entered. She simply watched, still as a rabbit scenting a fox. "Good morning," Erin said gently, keeping her distance. "I'm Miss Rivera." "You may call me Miss Erin, if you like." The child said nothing. Her eyes tracked Erin's movements as she crossed to the window seat and sat down, deliberately choosing not to loom over the little girl. "Your father has engaged me as your new governess," Erin continued, keeping her voice soft and even. "I understand you've had several governesses before me." Still nothing. But something flickered in those grey eyes. Recognition, perhaps. Or resignation. "I imagine," Erin said carefully, "that it must be tiring. Learning new names. New faces. Never knowing how long someone will stay." Lady Eloin's fingers tightened almost imperceptibly in her lap. "I also imagine," Erin went on, "that people have told you things about yourself. That you're difficult. That you drive people away. That you're the reason they leave." The child's composure cracked. It was the smallest of fractures, a tremor in her chin, a brightness in her eyes that might have been tears, but Erin saw it clearly. "My lady," she said gently, leaning forward. "May I tell you something true?" Lady Eloin's gaze darted to the door, then back to Erin. A tiny nod. "When people leave, it's never because of you. It's because of them. Because they weren't strong enough, or kind enough, or patient enough. But it's never, ever because you're difficult." "Miss Alderton said I was wicked," the child whispered. Her voice was so small Erin almost missed it. "She said I had the devil in me." Rage bloomed hot and sudden in Erin's chest, but she kept her expression calm. "Miss Alderton was wrong. And cruel. And I'm very sorry she said that to you. Miss Pembroke said I was unteachable. Also wrong. Miss Hartley cried and said I'd given her the headache for a week." Lady Eloin's voice was gaining strength now, as though releasing poison from a wound. "And Miss Gooding told Papa I was willful and ungovernable and she wouldn't stay another day, not for twice the salary." "And what do you think?" Erin asked quietly. "Do you think you're all those things?" The little girl looked down at her hands. "I must be. Everyone says so. And everyone leaves. I won't." Lady Eloin's head snapped up, her expression caught between hope and disbelief. "You will." They all do. I won't, Erin repeated firmly. Not because you're difficult or wicked or any of those other terrible words. I'll stay because I gave your father my word, and because I think you and I might become friends. Would you like that? To be friends? The child stared at her for a long moment, and Erin could see the war playing out behind those grey eyes. The desire to believe warring with the certainty of disappointment. Friends don't have lessons, Lady Eloin said finally, testing. Friends absolutely have lessons, Erin countered with a small smile. But friends also have stories, and songs, and sometimes they have adventures. Even small, indoor adventures when the weather is foul. Papa says there are no adventures. Only duty and deportment. Your papa, Erin said carefully, is very wise about many things. But I suspect he's forgotten what it's like to be 6 years old. For the first time, the ghost of a smile touched Lady Eloin's lips. It vanished almost immediately, replaced by wariness, but Erin had seen it. Would you like to show me your books? Erin asked, rising from the window seat. I noticed you have quite a collection. Lady Eloin slid off the bed with practiced grace, her movements careful and measured. As she led Erin to the bookshelf, she glanced back over her shoulder. Miss Erin. Yes, my lady. Do you promise? That you won't leave. Erin's heart broke a little. I promise I will do everything in my power to stay. Is that fair? The child considered this, then nodded solemnly. That's fair. As Lady Eloin began pulling books from the shelf, still arranged by height when she returned them, Erin noticed, she spoke again, so softly Erin almost missed it. I'm glad you're here. Even if you do leave like the others. Erin knelt beside her, meeting those wounded grey eyes. I'm glad I'm here too. And Lady Eloin? I think we're going to surprise everyone, your father most of all. The child didn't smile, but something in her posture softened, just slightly. It was enough. For now, it was enough. The Duke's schedule allowed for 1 hour of outdoor exercise between 2 and 3 o'clock, weather permitting. Unfortunately, the weather had not permitted for 3 consecutive days, and Lady Eloin was developing the restless energy of a caged bird. Erin found her that afternoon standing at the nursery window, her small forehead pressed against the glass, watching rain streak down the panes. The child's shoulders were hunched with a tension no 6-year-old should carry. My lady, Erin said, setting aside the grammar primer they'd been working through, I believe we've had quite enough of conjugating verbs for one day. Lady Eloin turned, surprise flickering across her carefully composed features. But Papa's schedule says lessons until 4 o'clock. Yes, well. Erin rose from the writing desk and moved to the center of the nursery. I've been thinking about your father's schedule, and I've discovered something terribly important. The child's eyes widened slightly. What? It makes absolutely no provision for ducks. Silence. Lady Eloin blinked at her, clearly uncertain whether she'd heard correctly. Ducks, you see, are extremely important, Erin continued, perfectly serious. One cannot have a proper education without understanding ducks. Their habits, their preferences, their peculiar way of walking. She demonstrated, tucking her arms against her sides and waddling across the nursery floor with exaggerated hip movements. Lady Eloin's hand flew to her mouth, but not quickly enough to hide the smile. Emboldened, Erin waddled back, affecting a pompous expression. Now, ducks are very dignified creatures. They believe themselves to be quite important. They waddle about with great authority, as though they own the entire pond. Like Papa, Lady Eloin whispered, then immediately looked terrified, as though she'd committed treason. Erin felt a grin tugging at her lips. I couldn't possibly comment on whether your father resembles a duck, my lady. That would be most improper. But he does, the child insisted, her voice gaining strength. When he walks through the hall, he's very stiff. And important. Like he's quite certain everyone should move out of his way. Quite quackers, one might say. Lady Eloin gasped, then, finally, wonderfully, she laughed. It was a rusty sound, as though her laughter hadn't been used in some time, but it was genuine. Quite quackers, she repeated, testing the words, delighted by the pun. Precisely. Now, I think this calls for a proper song. Every important subject deserves a song. Erin cleared her throat theatrically. Shall we compose one together? A song about Papa? A song about a duck. A very dignified, important duck who happens to be a duke. Any resemblance to actual persons is purely coincidental. The little girl scrambled off the window seat, her earlier listlessness forgotten. What should it say? Well, let's see. Erin tapped her chin thoughtfully. There once was a duke who looked like a duck. Who waddled about, Lady Eloin added, catching on immediately, and was quite out of luck. Because everyone noticed his quackery ways, Erin continued, beginning to waddle again. And his feathers got ruffled on rainy old days. Lady Eloin giggled, actually giggled, and began to waddle alongside Erin. They processed around the nursery together, Erin making up verses as they went, Lady Eloin adding lines with increasing confidence. The child's imagination, Erin discovered, had merely been dormant, not absent. She suggested the Duke might wear a tiny crown between his feathers, that he might demand all other ducks bow when he passed, that he might issue proclamations about proper pond behavior. He published a schedule for swimming each day, Erin sang, waddling past the bookshelf. No splashing allowed, in the dignified way. Lady Eloin added, her face flushed with laughter. But one little duckling refused to comply. She splashed and she played and she quacked to the sky. They collapsed together on the floor, breathless with laughter, when the door opened. The laughter died immediately. The Duke of Montford stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable as winter. Behind him, Mrs. Fairchild looked triumphant in a grim sort of way. Lady Eloin scrambled to her feet, her face draining of colour. The joy that had animated her moments before vanished as though it had never existed. She stood with her hands folded, her eyes fixed on the floor, the perfect image of a chastened child. Erin rose more slowly, her heart hammering but her chin lifted. She would not apologize for giving a child an hour of happiness. Your Grace, she said evenly. We were just. I heard what you were doing, Miss Rivera. His voice was glacier cold. The entire East Wing heard what you were doing. Papa, I'm sorry, Lady Eloin whispered, her voice small and terrified. I'll be good. I promise I'll be good. The Duke's gaze shifted to his daughter, and something flickered in those grey eyes. Pain, perhaps. Or recognition. But his expression remained severe. Lady Eloin, return to your lessons. Miss Rivera, a word. In the corridor. The child shot Erin a desperate look, an apology, a plea, a goodbye, before fleeing to her writing desk. Her small shoulders were shaking. Erin followed the Duke into the corridor, and Mrs. Fairchild closed the nursery door with an audible click. I can explain, Your Grace. I specifically instructed you, the Duke said, his voice dangerously quiet, that Lady Eloin requires structure. Discipline. I do not recall authorizing waddling. Or songs mocking her father. It wasn't mockery. It was play. She's a child. She is Lady Eloin Coon, and she was behaving like a common. He stopped himself, jaw tight. Like a child, Erin finished firmly. She was behaving like a 6-year-old child who's been given permission to be happy for the first time in months. Possibly years. Happiness, the Duke said, is not the objective. Proper deportment is the objective. Self-control is the objective. She's 6 years old. Erin's voice rose despite herself. Self-control? She has more self-control than most adults I know. She sits perfectly still for hours, speaks only when spoken to, never complains, never asks for anything. Do you know what she told me yesterday? That she must be wicked because everyone leaves her. That she's unteachable and ungovernable and has the devil in her. Those are the words your previous governesses left her with, Your Grace. Is that the proper deportment you're cultivating? The Duke's expression hardened further, if such a thing were possible. My daughter's discipline is not your concern. Your concern is following my instructions, which you have flagrantly disregarded. Then dismiss me, Erin said, surprising herself. Send me back to London tonight. But know this, I gave your daughter 1 hour of laughter. 1 hour where she wasn't terrified of making a mistake or saying the wrong thing or being too loud or too happy. 1 hour where she was just Eloin, not Lady Eloin Coon of Montford House. And what happens, the Duke asked coldly, when she's expected to behave properly in society? When she's required to display the deportment befitting her station? Will your duck songs prepare her for that, Miss Rivera? What happens, Erin countered, when she's so afraid of being herself that she becomes hollow inside? When all that's left is the performance, and the girl underneath is gone entirely. For a moment, just a moment, something cracked in the Duke's icy composure. His gaze slid past her to the nursery door, and the pain in his eyes was raw and unmistakable. Then it was gone, shuttered behind winter ice once more. You have 3 weeks remaining in your trial period, Miss Rivera. I suggest you use them to demonstrate that you can follow instructions. Good afternoon. He walked away, his footsteps echoing down the corridor, measured, precise, and utterly alone. Erin stood there for a long moment, her hands trembling with anger and something else. Something that felt uncomfortably like sympathy. When she returned to the nursery, Lady Eloin was at her desk, eyes red but dry, copying Latin verbs in perfect script. I'm sorry, Miss Erin, she whispered without looking up. I shouldn't have laughed. I ruined everything. Erin knelt beside her chair and gently turned it so they were face to face. Eloin, look at me. The child's grey eyes, so like her father's, were swimming with tears. You didn't ruin anything, Erin said firmly. You were perfect. And we're going to laugh again. I promise you that. But Papa said. Your Papa is scared. And people who are scared sometimes forget how to be happy. But we're going to remind him. You and I together. Lady Eloin studied her face, searching for the lie. Finding none, she nodded slowly. Can we sing the duck song again? Tomorrow? Erin smiled. Tomorrow, and every day after. Though perhaps more quietly. Very quietly, Lady Eloin agreed. Then, so softly Erin almost missed it, I think Papa might need a song too. He looks very sad when he thinks no one's watching. Erin's heart clenched. I think you're right, my lady. I think you're exactly right. John Coon, Duke of Montford, prided himself on his self-control. It was the foundation upon which he had rebuilt his life after Catherine's death, a bulwark against chaos, against feeling, against the crushing weight of loss that threatened to destroy him entirely. He maintained his household with military precision, raised his daughter according to the strictest principles, and never, under any circumstances, allowed emotion to cloud his judgment. Which made it all the more disturbing that he found himself standing outside the nursery door at 3:30 in the afternoon, listening. He had come to review Lady Eloin's progress in arithmetic, as was his custom every Wednesday. He had raised his hand to knock. And then he had heard something that stopped him cold. Laughter. Not the polite, restrained sound he might have expected from a properly conducted lesson, but genuine, breathless, uncontrolled laughter. His daughter's laughter. A sound he hadn't heard in so long he'd almost forgotten what it sounded like. No, wait. Lady Eloin's voice rang out, bright with excitement. The Duck Duke should have a tiny scepter. A very important tiny scepter. Excellent addition, came Miss Rivera's warm response. And what does he do with this very important tiny scepter? He taps it on the ground when he's displeased. Like this, tap, tap, tap. The sound of small feet stomping. And all the other ducks must freeze and look respectful. Even when they desperately want to giggle. Especially then. More laughter. The kind that comes from the belly, unguarded and free. John's hand remained frozen inches from the door. He should enter. He should put a stop to this nonsense immediately. This was not what he was paying Miss Rivera for. This was exactly the sort of undisciplined frivolity that would ruin his daughter's character. But he didn't move. Now, Miss Rivera was saying, let's practice our French vocabulary. But we'll do it as the ducks would. Can you tell me the French word for pond in your most dignified duck voice? Latang, Lady Eloin pronounced carefully, then added with exaggerated pomposity, and all lesser ducks must refer to it as His Grace's distinguished aquatic domain. Miss Rivera's delighted laughter joined his daughter's, and John felt something uncomfortable twist in his chest. When was the last time he had heard Eloin laugh? Truly laugh, not the careful, measured sound she made when she thought he expected it. He thought back. Months. Perhaps longer. Perhaps not since Catherine. No. He would not think of Catherine. He lowered his hand and turned away from the door, walking blindly down the corridor. His footsteps echoed in the silence of the east wing, measured and precise as always, but his thoughts were in dangerous disarray. The library was empty at this hour, and John shut the door behind him with more force than necessary. He poured himself a brandy, it was early, but damn propriety, and stood at the window overlooking the gardens. The rain had finally stopped, leaving everything drenched and grey. Rather like his life, he thought, then immediately castigated himself for the melodrama. He was the Duke of Montford. He did not indulge in self-pity. But he couldn't stop hearing that laughter. She sounded happy, he said aloud to the empty room, then felt foolish for speaking. Of course she sounded happy. That was precisely the problem. Happiness was dangerous. Happiness made one vulnerable. Happiness opened the door to devastation. He had learned that lesson thoroughly. Catherine had been happy. Gloriously, radiantly happy, right up until the fever took her. She had laughed with that same unguarded joy, had filled Montford House with light and warmth and chaos. And when she died, the silence she left behind had been unbearable. So he had created structure. Order. Rules that would keep chaos at bay, that would protect Eloin from the kind of wild, uncontrolled emotions that led only to pain. Except Miss Rivera's words kept echoing in his mind, what happens when she's so afraid of being herself that she becomes hollow inside? Was Eloin hollow? He thought of his daughter at dinner, silent, perfect, barely touching her food. He thought of her in the drawing room during his monthly inspections of her accomplishments, performing her pieces on the pianoforte with flawless technique and absolutely no feeling. He thought of the way she flinched when he entered a room, as though bracing for criticism. He thought of the way she had looked at him this afternoon, her face draining of color, immediately assuming she had done something wrong. "I'll be good, Papa. I promise I'll be good." She was always good. Perfectly, impeccably good. She never complained, never asked for anything, never caused trouble. She never laughed. Not until Miss Rivera arrived. John drained his brandy and poured another, aware he was drinking too quickly and not particularly caring. 3 days. Miss Rivera had been in his household for 3 days, and already she had turned everything upside down. The woman was impossible. Impertinent. Completely disregarding his carefully constructed schedule. Teaching his daughter to mock him, to mock the Duke of Montford himself, with ridiculous songs about waddling ducks. He should dismiss her immediately. But Eloin had laughed. A knock at the library door interrupted his brooding. "Enter," he called, grateful for the distraction. Mrs. Fairchild appeared, her expression carefully neutral in that way that meant she had opinions she was too well trained to voice. Your Grace, I thought you should know that Lady Eloin has requested supper in the nursery this evening. With Miss Rivera. This was not unusual. Eloin always took supper in the nursery. She asked for it, Mrs. Fairchild clarified. Specifically, she said. The housekeeper paused, as though uncertain whether to continue. Yes? She said she wanted to tell Miss Erin about the gardens. She had questions about the flowers and thought perhaps they might look at botanical drawings together. John stared at the housekeeper. Eloin had questions. Yes, Your Grace. Several, apparently. About rose varieties and soil composition and something to do with bees. When was the last time his daughter had asked a question? When was the last time she had expressed curiosity about anything at all? I see, he said slowly. That will be acceptable. Mrs. Fairchild hesitated. Your Grace, if I may speak freely. You may. Lady Eloin seems different. These past 3 days. More animated. I heard her singing this morning while she dressed. I can't recall the last time I heard her sing. She was singing about ducks, I believe. Yes, Your Grace. Very enthusiastic about the ducks. The ghost of a smile touched Mrs. Fairchild's lips. If I may say so, it was lovely to hear. After the housekeeper left, John returned to the window. The sky was clearing, patches of blue appearing between the clouds. In the garden below, he could see the reflecting pool, its surface still disturbed by raindrops. Catherine had loved that pool. She used to take Eloin there as an infant, pointing out the fish, the water lilies, the dragonflies that skimmed the surface. Their daughter had been perhaps 2 years old, and she had squealed with delight every time a fish appeared, her small hands clapping together. When had Eloin stopped squealing? When had she stopped clapping? When had he stopped allowing her to be a child? The thought was uncomfortable, settling in his chest like a stone. He had been protecting her. Preparing her for a world that demanded perfection from women of her station. Teaching her self-control and dignity and all the qualities that would serve her well in society. But at what cost? Do you know what she told me yesterday? That she must be wicked because everyone leaves her. That she's unteachable and ungovernable and has the devil in her. John's hands tightened on his glass. Had Eloin truly believed these things? Had his own hired governesses, women he had trusted with his daughter's education, said such things to a child? And if they had, why hadn't she told him? Because you never asked, a voice whispered in his mind. Because you only inquired about her progress in Latin and arithmetic. Because you never asked if she was happy. Because you were afraid of the answer. The admission left him feeling exposed, vulnerable in a way he hadn't allowed himself to feel since Catherine's death. He had built walls around his grief, around his heart, around everything that mattered. And somewhere in the process, he had built walls around his daughter too. Miss Rivera was dismantling those walls with duck songs and laughter, and John wasn't certain whether to be grateful or terrified. Probably both. He set down his glass and moved to his desk, pulling out the schedule he had written for Eloin's education. He studied it now with fresh eyes, seeing not the careful structure he had intended but the rigidity Miss Rivera had accused him of. 7 o'clock, rise and dress. 8 o'clock, breakfast. 9 to noon, lessons. 1 to 2, exercise. 2 to 4, more lessons. 6 o'clock, supper. 8 o'clock, bed. No time for questions about flowers. No time for singing. No time for being 6 years old. No time for laughter. John pulled out a fresh sheet of paper, then stopped, pen hovering over the blank page. What was he doing? Revising his entire philosophy of child-rearing because one impertinent governess had made his daughter giggle. Yes, the uncomfortable voice in his mind answered. Exactly that. He set down the pen and pressed his fingers to his temples. This woman, this impossible, infuriating woman, had been in his house less than a week, and already she had him questioning everything he thought he knew about raising his daughter. The worst part was that she might be right. The thought sent ice through his veins, because if she was right, then he had spent 2 years doing everything wrong. 2 years turning his daughter into a perfect, hollow automaton instead of helping her grieve her mother, heal, and learn to be happy again. 2 years punishing her for his own inability to cope with loss. God, he said aloud, the word falling into the silence like a confession. Someone had to break first, the frozen duke or the frightened child. He had thought rigidity was strength. Perhaps it was only another kind of cowardice. John rose and walked to the door, then stopped. He couldn't go to the nursery now. He couldn't face his daughter with these revelations still raw in his mind. He needed time to think, to restore his equilibrium, to decide what, if anything, he was going to do about Miss Rivera and her duck songs. But as he stood in the doorway of his library, he heard it again, the echo of his daughter's laughter, bright and genuine and achingly beautiful. And for the first time in 2 years, John Kuhn allowed himself to wonder if perhaps there was another way. The summons came at 8 o'clock in the evening, delivered by a stone-faced footman who informed Erin that His Grace required her presence in the study. Immediately. Erin's stomach dropped. She had just finished tucking Lady Eloin into bed. The child had finally fallen asleep clutching a small notebook where they'd been sketching ducks throughout the day. They had been careful, so careful, to keep their laughter quiet. But perhaps not quiet enough. She descended the main staircase this time, not the servants' stairs, her borrowed dress rustling in the oppressive silence of the house. Montford House at night was even more forbidding than during the day, all shadows and cold marble and the weight of centuries of ducal disapproval. The study door stood open, spilling warm light into the corridor. Erin paused at the threshold, gathering her courage. The Duke stood with his back to the door, silhouetted against the fireplace. He had shed his coat, and his shirt sleeves were rolled to his elbows, the most informal she had ever seen him. Somehow, this made him more intimidating rather than less. Without the armor of his perfectly tailored clothing, he seemed more human. More dangerous. "Come in, Miss Rivera." "Close the door." Erin obeyed, her heart hammering. This was it, then. Dismissal. 3 weeks early, without reference, without the quarter's salary that might have at least paid for her journey back to London. She had known it was coming. She had risked it deliberately. But knowing didn't make it easier. "Your Grace. Do you know what I did this afternoon, Miss Rivera?" He turned to face her, and she was startled to see that his expression wasn't angry. It was something else entirely. Something raw and uncertain. "I stood outside the nursery door for nearly 20 minutes, listening to my daughter laugh." Erin's breath caught. "Your Grace, I can explain." 20 minutes, he continued, as though she hadn't spoken. "I stood there like a fool, my hand raised to knock, unable to move. Do you know why?" She shook her head mutely. "Because I couldn't remember the last time I heard that sound." His voice was rough, stripped of its usual cold precision. "My own daughter's laughter, Miss Rivera, and I couldn't remember when I had last heard it. What does that make me?" It was clearly not a question he expected her to answer, but Erin found herself speaking anyway. "It makes you human, Your Grace. It makes you someone who has suffered a terrible loss and is trying to protect what remains." "Protect?" He laughed, a bitter sound. "Is that what I've been doing? Mrs. Fairchild informed me that Eloin is asking questions now. About flowers and bees and soil composition. Apparently she wants to learn botanical drawing." He moved to his desk, bracing his hands on its surface. "She hasn't asked me a question in over a year, Miss Rivera. Not one. I thought she was simply immature for her age. properly reserved. She's terrified of you, Erin said quietly. His head snapped up, grey eyes blazing. I have never raised a hand to that child. Never even raised my voice. I know. That's not the kind of fear I mean. Erin took a step closer, knowing she was about to cross a line from which there was no return. She's terrified of disappointing you. Of being too loud, too happy, too much of anything. She's terrified that if she makes one mistake, you'll leave her too. That's absurd. I'm her father. And her mother died. Erin's voice was gentle but unyielding. And 4 governesses left. And you spent 2 years teaching her that emotions are dangerous, that laughter is frivolous, that the only acceptable state of being is perfect, controlled, silent obedience. What conclusion should a 6-year-old draw from that, Your Grace? The Duke's jaw tightened. You overstep, Miss Rivera. I know. But someone needs to say it. She took another step forward. You're not protecting her. You're suffocating her. And the worst part is, I don't think you even see it. I see perfectly well. Do you? The words came out more forcefully than Erin intended, but she couldn't stop now. Do you see the way she flinches when you enter a room? The way she holds herself so rigidly at dinner that she barely eats? The way she apologizes for everything, for breathing too loudly, for asking to use the privy, for existing? She is learning discipline. She's learning to disappear. Erin's hands clenched at her sides. She's learning that the only safe way to exist is to not exist at all. And do you want to know what she told me today, Your Grace? She said you look sad when you think no one's watching. She said she wishes she could make you happy but doesn't know how. The Duke went very still. She said that. She's 6 years old, and she's trying to fix her grieving father while simultaneously trying to erase herself so she doesn't make things worse. Does that sound like proper deportment to you? Or does that sound like a child who's drowning? For a long moment, the only sound in the study was the crackling of the fire. The Duke stared at her, his expression cycling through anger, denial, and finally something that looked like pain. You have no right, he said finally, but his voice lacked conviction. I have every right. You hired me to help your daughter, and that's what I'm trying to do. But I can't do it alone, Your Grace. Not when you're working against me at every turn. Working against, he pushed away from the desk, anger flaring again. I am attempting to raise my daughter to survive in a society that will show her no mercy if she displays weakness. I am teaching her the skills she will need. When? Erin interrupted. When will she need them? At 16? 20? Are you planning to keep her locked in this mausoleum until then, practicing deportment and conjugating Latin verbs? Or are you hoping that by the time she's old enough to enter society, there will be nothing left of the real Eloin at all? Just a perfectly programmed automaton who never laughs, never questions, never feels anything. That is not what he stopped, his composure finally cracking. I am trying to keep her safe. Safe from what? Erin pressed. From joy? From childhood? From life itself? From loss? The words burst from him with such force that Erin actually took a step back. From loving someone so much that losing them destroys you. From being happy one moment and shattered the next. He stopped abruptly, as though realizing what he'd revealed. The silence that followed was profound. Your Grace, Erin said softly, understanding flooding through her. You're not protecting Eloin from loss. You're terrified of losing her the way you lost your wife. Don't. His voice was sharp, warning. But Erin had gone too far to stop now. You think if she never laughs, if she never becomes too attached to happiness, then if something happens, when something happens, it won't hurt as much. You think you're teaching her strength, but you're teaching her that love isn't worth the risk. That joy isn't worth the pain. That it's safer to be hollow than to be whole. You know nothing about it. His hands were trembling now, though whether with rage or something else, Erin couldn't tell. You know nothing about watching someone you love die. About holding her hand while she burns with fever. About promising her you'll take care of your daughter and then having no idea how to do it without her. You know nothing about waking up every morning in a house that's too quiet, too empty, too full of memories that cut like glass. So don't you dare stand there and tell me I'm not protecting my child. I'm not saying you don't love her, Erin said, her own voice thick with emotion. I'm saying you love her so much it's strangling you both. You're so afraid of losing her that you've already lost her. The real her. The one who laughs and asks questions and gets excited about bees. She's still in there, but she's buried under so many layers of fear and rules and perfect behavior that I'm not sure she even remembers who she is anymore. The Duke turned away, his shoulders rigid. Get out. Your Grace. I said get out. His voice was dangerously quiet. Pack your things. You'll leave first thing in the morning. Erin's heart sank, but she had expected this. As you wish, Your Grace. But before I go, answer me one question. I don't owe you. When Eloin is grown, 20 years from now, 30, and she's married some appropriate aristocrat and produced the requisite heirs and done everything properly, and you see her at some ball or dinner, perfect and poised and utterly empty inside, will you be proud? Will you think to yourself, I succeeded? I kept her safe. Or will you wonder where your daughter went? He didn't answer. Didn't turn around. Just stood there, silhouetted against the fire, his hands clenched at his sides. Erin waited for a moment, hoping he might say something. Anything. But the silence stretched on, and finally she turned toward the door. She had her hand on the handle when his voice stopped her. Miss Rivera. She looked back. He still hadn't turned around, but his voice had changed. The anger was gone, replaced by something that sounded almost like desperation. What am I supposed to do? The question was so quiet she almost missed it. How am I supposed to let her be happy when happiness can be taken away in an instant? When love leads only to devastation? How am I supposed to teach her it's safe to feel when I know how unsafe it truly is? Erin's throat tightened. You teach her that the love is worth the loss, Your Grace. That the joy is worth the grief. That a life half lived out of fear is no life at all. She paused. Your wife, she would want Eloin to laugh, wouldn't she? The Duke's shoulders sagged, and for a moment, he looked less like the formidable Duke of Montford and more like a man who was simply, desperately tired. Yes, he said finally, his voice breaking on the word. Catherine would have hated everything I've done. She would have, he stopped, his breath hitching. She loved to laugh. She filled this house with light and music and chaos, and when she died, I couldn't bear it. The silence. The emptiness. So I made rules. Structure. Anything to keep the chaos at bay. Anything to never feel that vulnerable again. And Eloin paid the price. And Eloin paid the price, he repeated, the admission seeming to cost him something essential. Erin crossed back to where he stood, close enough to see the tension in his jaw, the grief he'd been carrying like armor for 2 years. It's not too late, Your Grace. She's 6 years old. She still remembers how to laugh, I've heard it. She still wants to love you, she told me so. But you have to let her. You have to be brave enough to let her be happy, even knowing that happiness is fragile. Even knowing it might break your heart. He finally turned to face her, and Erin was shocked to see moisture in his winter-grey eyes. And if I can't, he asked. If I'm not that brave? Then learn, Erin said simply. Learn alongside her. Let her teach you how to laugh again. Let yourself remember that life, real life, requires risk. Requires vulnerability. Requires loving people even when you know you might lose them. She smiled sadly. Start with duck songs, Your Grace. They're surprisingly therapeutic. For a long moment, they stood there in the firelit study, the Duke of Montford and the impertinent governess who had just dismantled everything he thought he knew about protecting his daughter. Then, impossibly, the Duke laughed. It was a broken sound, rough with disuse and grief, but it was genuine. Duck songs, he repeated, shaking his head. My daughter thinks I resemble a duck. A very dignified, important duck, Erin clarified. Quite quackers, one might say. He laughed again, and this time it sounded a little less broken. You are the most impertinent woman I have ever met, Miss Rivera. Yes, Your Grace. Will you still dismiss me in the morning? The Duke studied her for a long moment, and something in his expression shifted. The ice was still there, but it was beginning to thaw. No, he said finally. I don't believe I will. Though God knows I should, if only for my own sanity. He moved to his desk and pulled out a sheet of paper. This is the schedule I created for Eloin. I'd like you to look at it and revise it as you see fit. Erin took the paper, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. Your Grace? My methods have clearly failed. Perhaps it's time to try yours. He met her gaze, and for the first time, she saw something other than ice in those grey eyes. Something warm and tentative and terrified. Teach her to laugh, Miss Rivera. Teach her to ask questions. Teach her to be, his voice caught, teach her to be the child Catherine would have wanted her to be. Can you do that? Yes, Erin said, her own eyes stinging with tears. Yes, Your Grace. I can do that. Good. He cleared his throat, attempting to restore some semblance of ducal dignity. And Miss Rivera? The salary. We should discuss increasing it to, shall we say, £40 per annum. Erin's breath caught. £40. Enough to save her father's estate. Enough to rebuild her life. Your Grace, that's very generous. It's practical. I suspect you'll earn every penny dealing with both my daughter and myself. He almost smiled. We're both rather difficult, it seems. Quite quackers, Erin agreed softly. This time, when the Duke laughed, it sounded almost like freedom. The fire had burned low by the time the Duke finally gestured toward the chairs near the hearth. Sit, Miss Rivera. Please. I find I'm weary of conducting this conversation at a formal distance. Erin hesitated, acutely aware that sitting with the Duke in his private study at night crossed every boundary of propriety. But propriety seemed a small concern compared to the raw vulnerability she'd just witnessed. She settled into one of the leather chairs, and the Duke took the other, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees, his hands clasped loosely between them. The firelight cast shadows across his face, softening the severe lines, making him look younger. More human. I should tell you about Catherine, he said abruptly. If you're to understand why I've been such a, what was your phrase? A frozen duke. I didn't say frozen, Your Grace. That was Eloin's interpretation of the duck song. His mouth twitched. Nevertheless. He stared into the dying fire, and when he spoke again, his voice was distant, as though he were speaking from some faraway place. We were married for 7 years. 7 years of, he stopped, searching for words. She was everything I wasn't. Warm where I was cold. Spontaneous where I was rigid. She laughed constantly. At everything. At me mostly, though never unkindly. Erin remained silent, sensing he needed to speak without interruption. When Eloin was born, Catherine was radiant. Terrified, of course, we both were, but radiant. She used to sing to her. Ridiculous songs about animals and nonsense rhymes that made no logical sense whatsoever. He smiled faintly at the memory. I told her they were absurd. That a duke's daughter should be raised on Mozart and proper lullabies. She laughed and told me I was a pompous bore and sang them louder. She sounds wonderful, Erin said softly. She was. She made this mausoleum, he gestured at the study, at Montford House beyond, feel like a home. She filled it with music and laughter and light. And his voice caught. I took it for granted. I assumed we would have decades together. That there was time for everything. Time to tell her how much I loved her chaos. Time to learn to laugh alongside her instead of merely tolerating her joy from a distance. He fell silent for a long moment, his jaw working as though the next words required physical effort to speak. The fever came suddenly. One morning she was fine, laughing over breakfast, planning a trip to London, discussing which flowers to plant in the East Garden. By evening she was bedridden. By the next morning, he stopped, his breath hitching. The doctors said there was nothing to be done. That these things happen. As though the complete destruction of my world was simply something that happens. I'm so sorry, Erin whispered. She made me promise, at the end. When she could barely speak, when the fever had taken everything but her will. His hands tightened until his knuckles went white. She made me promise I would take care of Eloin. That I would make sure our daughter was happy. That I wouldn't let grief consume me. A bitter laugh escaped him. I failed spectacularly at all three. Your Grace. No, let me finish. Please. He looked at her then, and the anguish in his grey eyes made Erin's chest ache. After Catherine died, the silence was unbearable. Eloin was only 4, too young to understand, old enough to feel the loss. She cried constantly. Asked for her mama every night. And his voice broke. I didn't know what to do. Every time she cried, it was like Catherine dying all over again. Every time she laughed, I heard Catherine's laugh, and the pain was so acute I couldn't breathe. So you created distance, Erin said, understanding flooding through her. Structure. Rules. Anything to keep the grief at bay. I told myself I was teaching her strength. Self-control. The qualities she would need to survive in a world that takes what you love without warning. He pressed the heels of his hands to his eyes. But the truth is, I was a coward. I was so terrified of losing her too that I pushed her away before I could become too attached. Before loving her could destroy me the way losing Catherine destroyed me. But you already love her, Erin said gently. Pushing her away doesn't change that. I know. God help me, I know. He dropped his hands, staring at them as though they belonged to someone else. And the worst part, the part that haunts me every time I look at my daughter, is that I'm failing Catherine. She trusted me with the most precious thing in her world, and I've turned our daughter into a silent, frightened shadow of what she should be. What right do I have to call myself her father when I've done nothing but fail her for 2 years? The raw self-loathing in his voice made Erin's throat tighten. Without thinking, she reached across the space between their chairs and placed her hand over his. The Duke went still, staring down at their hands as though he'd never seen such a thing before. You haven't failed her, Erin said firmly. You've made mistakes, yes. But you're here now. You're questioning. You're willing to change. That's what matters. Is it? He turned his hand over, his fingers curling tentatively around hers. The gesture was so uncertain, so unlike the cold, controlled Duke, that Erin's heart clenched. How do I even begin to repair what I've broken? One day at a time. One laugh at a time. One moment of being present with her instead of holding her at arm's length out of fear. Erin squeezed his hand gently. And you forgive yourself, Your Grace. You were drowning in grief. You did the best you could with the tools you had. My best wasn't good enough. Then do better now. She's 6 years old. You have time. But you have to be brave enough to try. They sat in silence for a moment, hands clasped, the fire crackling softly between them. The intimacy of the moment wasn't lost on Erin. She was holding the Duke of Montford's hand in his private study, offering comfort as though they were equals. As though propriety and station meant nothing compared to shared grief and understanding. "Catherine would have liked you," the Duke said suddenly. "She would have appreciated your impertinence. Your refusal to be cowed by titles and social conventions." He smiled faintly. "She probably would have helped you compose the duck song." Erin laughed softly. "I would have liked her too, I think. She would have told me I was being an idiot. She never hesitated to tell me when I was wrong, which was frequently." His thumb brushed absently across Erin's knuckles, and she tried to ignore the shiver that ran up her arm. "I miss that. I miss someone being honest with me. Everyone else simply defers and agrees and tells me what they think I want to hear. I'm not very good at deference, Your Grace. I've noticed. It's rather refreshing, actually. Terrifying, but refreshing." He looked up, meeting her eyes. "Thank you, Miss Rivera. For refusing to leave when I told you to. For standing in my daughter's corner even when it meant standing against me. For," he gestured vaguely with his free hand, "for seeing what I was too blind or too frightened to see." "You're welcome, Your Grace." "John," he said quietly. "When we're alone, you may call me John. I think we've moved rather beyond formal address at this point, don't you?" The informality sent a flutter through Erin's stomach. That would be highly improper. "Miss Rivera, we are sitting alone in my study at nearly 9 o'clock in the evening, holding hands and discussing my deepest failures as a father and husband. I believe we left propriety behind some time ago." His eyes held hers, and there was something warm in them now. Something that made her pulse quicken in a way that had nothing to do with fear of dismissal. "Unless you object." "I don't object." "John." His name felt strange on her tongue, too intimate, too familiar. But also right, somehow. As though they had crossed an invisible threshold and could never quite return to the formal distance of Duke and governess. "Erin," he said, testing her name the same way. "It suits you. Strong. Unpretentious. Rather like the woman herself." A chill wind rattled the study windows, and Erin shivered despite the fire. She had been so focused on their conversation that she hadn't noticed how cold the room had grown as the fire died. "You're cold," John said immediately, releasing her hand and rising. He crossed to where his coat lay draped over the back of his desk chair and returned with it. "Here." Before Erin could protest, he was draping the coat around her shoulders. His hands lingered there for a moment, and she was acutely aware of his proximity, the warmth radiating from him, the scent of sandalwood and something distinctly masculine that made her breath catch. "Better?" he asked softly. Erin nodded, not trusting her voice. The coat was warm from where it had hung near the fire, and it carried his scent. She felt enveloped by him, protected in a way that had nothing to do with physical cold and everything to do with the sudden intimacy between them. John seemed to realize at the same moment that he was standing far too close, his hand still resting on her shoulders. He stepped back quickly, clearing his throat. That is, it's late. You should rest. Tomorrow will be challenging," Erin finished, finding her voice. "Given that we're essentially starting over with Eloin's education." "Yes. Quite." But he didn't move toward the door. Instead, he stood there, looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. Gratitude, certainly. But there was something else there too. Something warmer and more dangerous. "John," Erin said carefully, knowing she should probably return his coat, stand up, put proper distance between them. "Thank you. For trusting me with this. With Eloin. She gestured vaguely, all of it." "Thank you for being trustworthy," he replied. Then, more quietly, and for not giving up on either of us. The moment stretched between them, charged with something Erin couldn't name but could definitely feel. It would be so easy, she thought, to cross the small distance between them. To reach for his hand again. I should go, she said abruptly, standing up. The coat started to slip from her shoulders, and John's hands came up automatically to catch it, to resettle it around her. Keep it, he said. The servant's wing is drafty. You can return it tomorrow. That's not, I couldn't. I insist. His hands were still on her shoulders, his face closer than was proper. Besides, I find I rather like seeing you in it. You look less like a governess and more like— He stopped himself, a faint flush rising in his cheeks. Never mind. I'm speaking nonsense. The hour is late, and I've clearly had too much brandy. But Erin had heard what he almost said. What he had stopped himself from saying. And judging by the way his eyes had darkened, the way his breath had quickened slightly, she suspected he was thinking the same dangerous thought she was. Good night, Your Grace, she said formally, trying to restore some sense of propriety to the moment. John, he corrected softly. When we're alone, it's John. Good night, John. Good night, Erin. She made herself walk to the door, acutely aware of his eyes following her. She made herself open it, step into the corridor, close it behind her. She made herself walk steadily toward the servant's stairs, his coat warm around her shoulders, his scent surrounding her. It wasn't until she reached her small room and closed the door that she allowed herself to acknowledge the truth. Something had changed between them tonight. Something that had nothing to do with Eloin or grief or education, and everything to do with two people who had seen each other's wounds and chosen to be gentle with them. Something dangerous. Something that could destroy them both if they weren't careful. She hung his coat carefully over the chair by her small desk and tried not to think about how much she had wanted him to kiss her in those final moments. Tried not to remember the warmth in his eyes or the way his hands had felt on her shoulders or the intimacy of sitting together in the firelight, sharing truths neither of them had spoken aloud before. Tomorrow, she told herself firmly, she would return to being Miss Rivera, the impertinent governess. He would return to being the Duke of Montford. But tonight, for just a few stolen hours, they had been simply Erin and John. Two broken people finding unexpected comfort in each other's honesty. And God help her, she wanted more of it. 3 weeks had passed since that night in the study, and Montford House had transformed in ways both visible and subtle. Lady Eloin now asked questions at breakfast, dozens of them, about everything from cloud formations to why Latin had so many verb conjugations. The nursery rang with laughter most afternoons. The Duke attended lessons twice a week, initially stiff and uncertain, but gradually learning to smile at his daughter's enthusiasm rather than correct it. And Erin had fallen hopelessly, irrevocably in love with him. It was a disaster of the highest order. She knew it. Acknowledged it every night as she lay in her narrow bed, John's coat still hanging on her chair like a reminder of everything she couldn't have. But knowing it was foolish didn't make it any less true. She saw him daily now, brief encounters in the corridor, longer ones when he joined them for lessons, stolen moments in the library when Eloin was napping. They spoke of books, of philosophy, of childhood memories and future hopes. They were careful never to touch, never to be alone too long. But the awareness between them hummed like a taut wire, growing more dangerous with each passing day. And then came the letter. Erin had been summoned to the study again, though this time the note had been cordial rather than commanding. Miss Rivera, if you would be so kind as to join me this afternoon at 4 o'clock. There are matters of business to discuss. M. She arrived precisely at 4, her heart racing for reasons that had nothing to do with business. John, she could only think of him as John now, though she never used his name aloud, was standing at his desk, several papers spread before him. Ah, Miss Rivera. Come in, please. Close the door. He gestured to the chair across from his desk, more formal than he'd been in weeks. I've been reviewing the household accounts. Erin's stomach sank. Was this it? Had he decided her methods were too unorthodox after all? That Eloin's education required someone more conventional? The original agreement, John continued, consulting one of the papers, was £15 per annum. After our discussion 3 weeks ago, I increased that to £40. Yes, Your Grace. It was very generous. It was inadequate, he said flatly. I've been making inquiries. The going rate for a governess of your skill and dedication, one who has successfully transformed a difficult child into a thriving, curious, happy one, is significantly higher. He pushed a document across the desk. I'm increasing your salary to £60 per annum, paid quarterly as before, effective immediately. Erin stared at the paper, the numbers swimming before her eyes. £60. More than enough to save her father's estate with money to spare. More than enough to secure her future. More than she deserved for falling in love with her employer. Your Grace, I can't possibly. You can and you will, he interrupted. Consider it compensation for dealing with my abysmal behavior when you first arrived. And for dealing with my continued presence during lessons, which I'm sure is highly irregular. Your presence is, Erin stopped herself, aware she was about to say something far too revealing. It's beneficial. For Eloin. She's thriving with your involvement. Is that the only reason it's beneficial? The question was casual, but his eyes held hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. My presence. Erin's pulse quickened. Your Grace. John, he corrected, standing and moving around the desk. When we're alone, it's John. We established that weeks ago, yet you persist in this formality whenever we discuss business. Why is that, I wonder? Because using your name makes it harder to remember you're my employer, Erin thought. Because it makes me forget all the reasons this can never be anything more than what it is. It's proper, she said instead, rising from her chair. You're the Duke of Montford. I'm your daughter's governess. There are lines that shouldn't be crossed. Lines, John repeated, moving closer. Yes. We've been very careful about lines, haven't we? Very proper. Very correct. He was close enough now that she could see the pulse beating at his throat. Except for that night 3 weeks ago, when you held my hand and I draped my coat around your shoulders and we both pretended we didn't feel what we felt. I don't know what you mean. The lie was unconvincing even to her own ears. Don't you? He reached out slowly, giving her time to step away. When she didn't, his fingers brushed a loose strand of hair from her face, tucking it behind her ear. The touch was feather-light, but it sent fire racing through her veins. I think you know exactly what I mean, Erin. Her name on his lips, spoken in that low, rough voice, nearly undid her. This is inappropriate. I should leave. His hand dropped back to his side, but he didn't step away. Is that what you want? To leave? No. The admission escaped before she could stop it. But I should want to. We can't, there are 100 reasons why this is impossible. Name one. You're a duke. I'm a penniless governess. I don't care about that. Society will. Society can go hang itself. The vehemence in his voice startled her. Name another. Eloin needs stability. A governess she can trust. Not, she gestured helplessly between them. Not whatever this is. What if this, he echoed her gesture, is exactly what Eloin needs? A father who remembers how to feel. How to be happy. How to take the risk of loving someone even when it terrifies him. Erin's heart was hammering so hard she thought he must surely hear it. You don't mean that. Don't I? He took another step closer, and she found herself backed against his desk, trapped between mahogany and the Duke of Montford. I've spent 3 weeks watching you bring my daughter back to life. Watching you bring me back to life. 3 weeks of proper distance and careful conversation and absolute torture, because all I want," his voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "All I want is to do what I should have done that night in this very study. What I've wanted to do every single day since." "John." His name came out breathless, pleading. "We can't." "Why not?" "Because I'm not Catherine." The words burst from her with unexpected force. "Because you loved her, and I won't, be some replacement. Some consolation prize because you're lonely and I happen to be here." The words hung between them, and Erin immediately wished she could take them back. John's expression shifted through shock, understanding, and then something that looked almost like anger. "Is that what you think?" he asked, his voice dangerously soft. "That I see you as a replacement for Catherine? Aren't I? The woman who made her laugh. Who filled her life with joy. Who—" "Stop." His hands came up to frame her face, forcing her to meet his eyes. "Erin, listen to me. You are nothing like Catherine. Nothing. She was spontaneous where you're thoughtful. Chaotic where you're steady. She approached the world with reckless abandon, you approach it with careful courage. Then why?" "Because I'm not the same man who loved Catherine," he continued, his thumbs brushing her cheeks with devastating gentleness. "I'm not the pompous young duke who took his wife's laughter for granted. I'm a broken, grieving widower who's learning to live again, and the woman teaching me isn't a replacement for what I lost. His voice caught. "She's something entirely new. Something I didn't know I could feel." "What are you saying?" Erin whispered, though her heart already knew. "I'm saying I love you," John said, the words rough with emotion. "God help me, I love you. Not because you remind me of Catherine, but because you're nothing like her. Because you're stubborn and impertinent and absolutely terrifying. Because you walked into my house during a storm and refused to be bullied. Because you saw my daughter drowning and threw her a lifeline. Because you looked at me, at the cold, frozen Duke, and decided I was worth saving too." Tears were streaming down Erin's face now, and she didn't care. "I love you too. I've tried not to. I've told myself 1,000 reasons why I shouldn't. But I do. I love you so much it frightens me." "Then be frightened with me," John said fiercely. "Be terrified and brave and reckless and careful all at once. But don't walk away. Don't leave me now that I've finally learned how to feel again." "The salary increase," Erin said suddenly, understanding flooding through her. "That wasn't about compensation. You were trying to bind you here," he admitted. "Give you financial security so you'd have no reason to leave. It was manipulative and calculating and utterly beneath me, but I was desperate. The thought of losing you," he stopped, his jaw tightening. "I couldn't bear it." "You impossible man," Erin said, half laughing, half crying. "You're supposed to court me with flowers and pretty words, not salary negotiations. I've never been very good at conventional courtship. Catherine used to say I romanced her with ledgers and investment strategies." His eyes searched hers. "Is it working?" "Surprisingly, yes." "Then tell me something, Erin Rivera." His voice dropped, intimate and urgent. "If I kissed you right now, properly, thoroughly, the way I've been dreaming of for weeks, would you slap me? Report me? Demand I uphold the proper boundaries between employer and governess?" "I would kiss you back," Erin breathed. "And damn the boundaries." The last word was barely out of her mouth before his lips found hers. It wasn't a tentative kiss. It wasn't careful or restrained or proper in any conceivable way. It was fierce and hungry and desperate, two people who had been holding themselves in check finally surrendering to what they'd been fighting. His hand slid from her face into her hair, scattering pins, while hers fisted in his waistcoat, pulling him closer. Erin had been kissed before, chaste, forgettable encounters with eligible gentlemen in her previous life. This was nothing like those. This was consuming. John kissed her like a man drowning and she was air, like he'd been starving and she was sustenance, like he'd been frozen for 2 years and she was finally warmth. She made a sound against his mouth, half gasp, half moan, and he responded by lifting her onto the edge of his desk, stepping between her knees in a way that would have scandalized every matron in London. Papers scattered to the floor. The salary agreement fluttered away, forgotten. Erin, he breathed against her lips, then her jaw, then the sensitive skin below her ear. God, Erin. I've wanted, needed. I know, she gasped, her head falling back to give him better access. I know. Me too. His mouth returned to hers, softer this time but no less intense. She could taste salt on his lips and realized one of them was crying. Perhaps both. Marry me, John said suddenly, pulling back just far enough to meet her eyes. His hair was disheveled from her fingers, his cravat askew, his eyes dark with desire and love and desperate hope. Marry me, Erin. Not because it's proper or convenient, but because I cannot imagine my life without you. Because Eloin deserves a mother who already loves her. Because I've been half alive for 2 years, and you've made me whole again. John, we can't, the scandal, your family. Will adjust, he said firmly. Or they won't. I find I don't particularly care anymore. I've spent 2 years living according to what society expects, what's proper, what's safe. And it nearly destroyed me and my daughter both. So to hell with scandal. To hell with propriety. Marry me. Yes, Erin heard herself say. Yes, you impossible, infuriating man. Yes. He kissed her again, slower this time, thorough and claiming. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, he rested his forehead against hers. I'm keeping you at £60 per annum, he murmured. Even after we're married. You've earned it. Erin laughed, the sound giddy and breathless. You're negotiating my future salary in the middle of a marriage proposal. I told you I wasn't good at conventional courtship. He smiled, genuinely smiled, the expression transforming his face entirely. Besides, Catherine always maintained financial independence was important for women. I suspect she and you would have gotten on rather well in that regard. At the mention of his late wife, Erin sobered slightly. Are you sure about this, John? Truly sure? I don't want you to wake up one day and regret. I won't, he interrupted. I loved Catherine. I will always love her. She was my first love, my first marriage, the mother of my child. But she's gone, Erin. And I think, his voice grew rough, I think she would be happy that I found you. That I found someone who could help me heal. Help Eloin heal. Help us become a family again, even if it's a different family than we were before. A family, Erin repeated softly, testing the word. With duck songs and laughter and probably a fair amount of chaos. God, I hope so. He kissed her forehead, her nose, her lips once more. When should we tell Eloin? Together. Tomorrow, perhaps? After she's had her breakfast and is in good spirits. Agreed. He helped her down from the desk, then immediately pulled her back against him, as though the small distance was unbearable. Though I'm not certain how I'll survive an entire night pretending nothing has changed. Pretending I'm not about to marry the most extraordinary woman in England. You'll manage, Erin said, but she didn't pull away. Instead, she buried her face against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. We both will. After all, we've survived 3 weeks of proper distance. What's one more night? An eternity, John murmured into her hair. But worth it, I suppose, to do this properly. To give Eloin time to adjust. 2. A soft knock at the study door made them spring apart like guilty children. John quickly straightened his cravat while Erin tried desperately to smooth her hair and restore the scattered pins. "Come," John called, his voice admirably steady. Mrs. Fairchild entered, her expression carefully neutral in a way that suggested she'd been standing outside long enough to draw certain conclusions. "Begging your pardon, Your Grace, but Lady Eloin is asking for Miss Rivera. Something about a promise to look at star charts before bed." "Of course," Erin said, grateful her voice sounded relatively normal despite her racing heart. "I'll go to her immediately." She moved toward the door, but John's voice stopped her. "Miss Rivera?" She turned back, and the warmth in his eyes, the open affection that he no longer bothered to hide, made her breath catch. "We'll continue our discussion tomorrow. After breakfast." "Yes, Your Grace. I look forward to it." As she left the study, acutely aware of Mrs. Fairchild's knowing gaze following her, Erin touched her lips, still tender from John's kisses. Tomorrow they would tell Eloin. Tomorrow they would begin planning a future that had seemed impossible just hours ago. But tonight, she would look at star charts with a 6-year-old who asked 100 questions and laughed at duck songs. Tonight, she would tuck that little girl into bed and promise her, truthfully, that she wasn't going anywhere. Tonight, for the first time in months, Erin Rivera would fall asleep not with dread of an uncertain future, but with joy for a certain one. A future filled with love and laughter and a family she never expected to find. Quite quackers, indeed. Chapter 8, The Social Storm. The announcement appeared in the Morning Post exactly 1 week after John proposed, carefully worded to present the engagement as a dignified union between the Duke of Montford and Miss Erin Rivera, daughter of the late Mr. James Rivera of Westmoreland. By afternoon, the scandal sheets had gotten hold of it. Erin first learned the extent of the damage when Mrs. Fairchild entered the morning room with a stack of newspapers, her expression grim. "Miss Rivera, I thought you should see these before His Grace does. He's with Lady Eloin in the nursery, and I thought perhaps you might want to prepare." Erin's stomach dropped as she took the papers. The headlines alone made her feel ill. Desperate governess ensnares grieving Duke. From servants' quarters to Duchess, the calculated rise of Miss Rivera. Fortune hunter preys on widower's vulnerability. She forced herself to read further, each word a knife twisted deeper. Sources close to the household report that Miss Rivera, a penniless nobody with no references and questionable breeding, insinuated herself into the Duke's confidence through his motherless daughter. The calculated seduction, for what else can one call it, began mere days after her arrival at Montford House. One must wonder what arts of persuasion the cunning Miss Rivera employed to convince a man of the Duke's station to so debase himself. That she possesses neither fortune, connections, nor even beauty to recommend her makes the match all the more suspicious. The late Duchess Catherine must be turning in her grave to see her beloved husband manipulated by a scheming adventuress who saw an opportunity and seized it with both grasping hands. The words blurred as tears filled Erin's eyes. She had expected some scandal, of course. A duke marrying his governess was unconventional at best. But this vicious character assassination, these accusations of calculation and manipulation. Miss Rivera? Erin looked up to find John standing in the doorway, his expression thunderous. He must have seen the newspapers in her hands, because he crossed the room in 3 strides and snatched them away. "Who gave you these?" His voice was dangerously quiet. "Mrs. Fairchild thought I should." She was wrong. He threw the papers into the fireplace, watching them curl and blacken. "You shouldn't have to read such filth." "John, I'm not made of glass." "I knew there would be talk." "Talk?" He rounded on her, and she was startled by the rage in his eyes. "Erin, they're calling you a fortune hunter. A seductress. They're suggesting you deliberately manipulated a grieving widower for your own advancement. It's unconscionable." "It's also what half of London will believe," Erin said quietly, sinking into a chair. Her hands were trembling. "I have no fortune, no connections, no prestigious family. What else are they supposed to think? That a duke fell in love with me for my sparkling personality. Yes. The word burst from him with such force that Erin flinched. That's exactly what they should think, because it's the truth. You're brilliant and brave, Anne. He stopped, running a hand through his hair in frustration. This is my fault. I should have anticipated this. Should have managed the announcement better, prepared you for being called ugly in print. Erin laughed bitterly, gesturing to where the papers had burned. For having my entire character reduced to grasping ambition? There's no preparing for that, John. He knelt before her chair, taking her hands in his. We'll issue a statement. I'll make it clear that the engagement is my choice, my decision, That will only make it worse, Erin interrupted. It will look like you're defending me because you know the accusations are true. Like you're too besotted to see that I've played you for a fool. Then what do you suggest? His grip on her hands tightened. That we simply endure this? Let them print whatever lies they please. I suggest, came a cold voice from the doorway, that you reconsider this entire ill-advised engagement. They both turned to find an elderly woman standing in the entrance to the morning room. She was tall and imposing, dressed in black silk despite the late spring warmth, with steel-grey hair and the same winter-ice eyes as John. Behind her stood a younger man, perhaps 30, with aristocratic features and an expression of barely concealed contempt. John rose slowly, his expression carefully blank. Lady Hartwell. Cousin Frederick. I wasn't aware you were calling today. Because you didn't invite us, Lady Hartwell said tartly, sweeping into the room without waiting for permission. I had to read about my nephew's engagement in the Morning Post like a common gossip. Along with, I might add, the rest of London. Aunt Margaret. Don't Aunt Margaret me, John. The elderly woman's gaze fell on Erin, assessing and dismissive in a single sweep. So this is the governess. Stand up, girl. Let me look at you properly. Erin's pride flared hot and immediate. She remained seated, meeting Lady Hartwell's imperious gaze with her chin lifted. I am not a horse at auction, my lady. If you wish to speak with me, you may do so while I'm seated. Lady Hartwell's eyebrows rose. Well, at least she has some spirit. That's something, I suppose. Aunt Margaret, I must ask you to show Miss Rivera the respect she deserves as your what, John? Your fiancée? Your future Duchess. Lady Hartwell laughed, a sharp sound devoid of humor. Have you lost your senses entirely? This woman, no matter how spirited, is completely unsuitable. No family, no fortune, no training for the position you're asking her to occupy. She has something far more important, John said coldly. My love. An Eloin's. Frederick spoke for the first time, his voice dripping with disdain. Love. How charmingly bourgeois. Tell me, cousin, did it occur to you that marrying your daughter's governess might reflect poorly on the family name? That it might damage your reputation, and by extension, all of ours? My reputation, John said through gritted teeth, is my own concern. Hardly, Frederick countered. You're the Duke of Montford. Your actions affect the entire family. And this, he gestured dismissively at Erin, this unfortunate infatuation is already causing precisely the sort of scandal we can least afford. Erin felt each word like a physical blow, but she forced herself to remain composed. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her crumble. I understand your concerns, she said quietly, addressing Lady Hartwell. I am, by any objective measure, an unsuitable match for a duke. I bring nothing to the union, no dowry, no connections, no advantage whatsoever. Finally, someone speaks sense, Frederick muttered. However, Erin continued, her voice gaining strength, I love your nephew. I love his daughter. And I would sooner die than bring them harm. So if you have come here to convince me to release him from our engagement, to spare him the scandal, the gossip, the damage to his reputation, then you need only ask. I will do it. Today. Now. Erin, no, John started, but she held up a hand. Let me finish. She stood now, facing Lady Hartwell directly. I will release him on one condition, that you can look me in the eye and tell me, honestly, that his life would be better without me in it. That Eloin would be happier with a proper duchess who knows all the right people and says all the right things but doesn't love her. That John would be better off married to some aristocrat's daughter who finds him a convenient match but doesn't see him, truly see him, the way I do. Tell me that, Lady Hartwell, and I will walk away this instant. The room fell silent. Lady Hartwell studied Erin for a long moment, her expression inscrutable. You love him that much? She asked finally. Enough to leave him. I love him enough to want his happiness above my own, Erin said simply. Even if that happiness doesn't include me. Lady Hartwell's stern expression softened almost imperceptibly. And what about your own happiness? Your own future? Surely you must see that marrying a duke would secure your position, your finances. If I cared about security and finances, Erin interrupted, I would have agreed to marry him the first time he proposed. But I made him wait. I made him prove that he loved me, truly loved me, and not because I was convenient or because Eloin needed a mother, but because he wanted me. Specifically me. So no, my lady, this is not about fortune hunting or social climbing. This is about two broken people who found something unexpected together. 3 broken people, John corrected, moving to stand beside Erin. Eloin adores her. She's thriving under Erin's care in ways she never did with any of the previous governesses. In ways she hasn't since Catherine died. At the mention of Catherine, Lady Hartwell's expression shifted. Your late wife would not have wanted this scandal, John. She cared deeply about the family reputation. Catherine cared about happiness, John said firmly. About love and laughter and living fully, regardless of what society thought. And I know, she would approve of Erin. Would be grateful that someone is helping Eloin heal. Helping me heal. Even at the cost of your standing in society. Frederick demanded. The clubs are already buzzing with it, cousin. They're taking bets on how long before she shows her true colors. Before she takes your money and runs, or... That's enough. John's voice cracked like a whip. I will not stand here and allow you to insult my future wife in her own home. Her own home. Frederick laughed incredulously. John, it's not her home. It's yours. She's a guest here. An employee, really, who's managed to. The sound of John's fist connecting with Frederick's jaw was shockingly loud in the morning room. Frederick staggered back, hand flying to his face. You struck me. I did, John agreed, his voice deadly calm despite the fury in his eyes. And I'll do it again if you continue to disrespect Miss Rivera. In fact, I think it's time for you to leave. Both of you. John, Lady Hartwell began. Now. He moved to the bell pull and yanked it sharply. Immediately. And you will not return to this house until you can treat my fiancée with the courtesy she deserves. A footman appeared in the doorway, his eyes widening at the scene before him. Show Lady Hartwell and Mr. Frederick out, John instructed coldly. They were just leaving. Lady Hartwell drew herself up to her full height, her expression glacial. You're making a terrible mistake, John. One that will cost you dearly. The only mistake I've made, John said, is allowing you to speak to Erin the way you have. Now get out of my house. Frederick, still holding his jaw, glared at them both with undisguised hatred. This isn't over, cousin. The family won't stand for this humiliation. You'll do nothing, John interrupted. Because if you attempt to harm Erin's reputation further, if you spread one more vicious rumor or publish one more scandalous paragraph, I will cut you off entirely. No more allowance, Frederick. No more access to the family coffers. You'll be on your own. Frederick's face went white. You wouldn't dare test me. After they left, the morning room fell into heavy silence. John stood at the window, his shoulders rigid, his right hand already showing signs of bruising. That was foolish, Erin said quietly. Striking him. It will only make things worse. I don't care. He didn't turn around. I won't stand by while my own family insults you. John, maybe they're right. The words cost Erin everything to speak. Maybe this is a mistake. Maybe I am too far beneath you. Maybe. Don't. He turned then, and the pain in his eyes stole her breath. Don't let them do this, Erin. Don't let their poison seep in and make you doubt us. It's not poison if it's true, she said, her voice breaking. I am a penniless governess. I do bring you nothing but scandal. Your family hates me. Society will never accept me. And Eloin, God, John, what happens when she's old enough to understand that her father's second wife is considered beneath him? That people whisper about her stepmother being a fortune hunter? How does that not damage her? It damages her more if we give in to their cruelty, John said fiercely, crossing to take her hands. If we teach her that love must bow to propriety, that happiness matters less than reputation, that we should sacrifice what's real and true and good because small-minded people with nothing better to do decide to judge us. But what if they're not wrong? Erin pulled her hands free, wrapping her arms around herself. What if I am ruining your life? What if 5 years from now, when the scandal hasn't died down, when you're still being snubbed at clubs and Eloin is facing whispers at finishing school, you look at me and wish you'd married someone appropriate instead? That will never happen. You can't know that. I can, John insisted. Because I would rather face 1,000 scandals with you than 1 day of empty propriety without you. Because the worst year of my life wasn't when Catherine died, it was the year after, when I was still breathing but not living. You brought me back, Erin. You and your impertinence and your duck songs and your refusal to let me hide behind ice and protocol. So no, 5 years from now, 50 years from now, I will not regret choosing you. I will only regret it if I let you go. Erin wanted desperately to believe him. But the words from the scandal sheets kept echoing in her mind, desperate. Fortune hunter. Calculated seduction. Too ugly to have any other option. I need time, she heard herself say. To think. To decide if I can really do this to you. To Eloin. To. Time. John's face went pale. Erin, you can't be saying you want to end the engagement. I'm saying I need time, she repeated, even as her heart shattered. Please, John. Give me that much. For a long moment, he simply stared at her. Then, slowly, he nodded. How much time? I don't know. A few days. A week, perhaps. A week. He said it like a death sentence. Very well. Take your week, Erin. But know this, at the end of it, whether you decide to marry me or not, my answer remains the same. I love you. I will always love you. And I will wait as long as it takes for you to believe that you deserve to be loved. He left the morning room without another word, leaving Erin alone with the ashes of scandal sheets in the fireplace and the weight of an impossible choice. She sank back into her chair and finally allowed herself to cry. Chapter 9, The Grand Ball and Beyond. Erin's week lasted exactly 3 days. On the first day, she remained in her room, unable to face John or Eloin, tortured by indecision. On the second day, she ventured down to the nursery and found Lady Eloin standing at the window, silent tears streaming down her face. Are you leaving? The child had asked in a small, broken voice. Like the others? Because of me. That single question, so heartbreaking, so achingly familiar, had shattered Erin's resolve entirely. "No," she had said, kneeling before the little girl and taking her hands. "Never because of you. And actually, my darling, I'm not leaving at all." On the third day, she found John in his study and said simply, "I choose you. I choose us. And I choose to stop being afraid." The relief in his eyes had been worth every scandal sheet in London. But relief and resolve didn't erase the problem of society's judgment. Which was why, 2 months later, Erin found herself standing in her dressing room at Montford House, staring at her reflection with something approaching terror. "You look beautiful, miss," her lady's maid, an absurdity she still couldn't quite believe, said as she made final adjustments to the gown. Beautiful was generous. The dress was exquisite, deep sapphire silk that brought out the blue in her eyes, with delicate embroidery along the bodice and sleeves. John had commissioned it from London's finest modiste, along with an entire wardrobe befitting a duchess-to-be. But no amount of fine clothing could hide what Erin knew society would see: a governess playing dress-up, a fortune hunter in borrowed plumage. Tonight was the ball, John's answer to the scandal. Rather than hiding from society's judgment, he had decided to face it head-on by hosting the grandest celebration Montford House had seen in years. 200 guests, including every important family in the county and half the peerage from London. An official introduction of Miss Rivera as the Duke's intended, with no apology and no shame. It was either brilliantly bold or spectacularly foolish. Possibly both. "His Grace is waiting for you in the gallery," the maid said softly. "He asked that you join him before the guests arrive." Erin found him standing before the portrait of Catherine, a beautiful woman with dark curls and a radiant smile, frozen forever in oil and canvas. John was already dressed in formal evening wear, devastatingly handsome in black and white, his posture rigid with tension. "She would have liked this gown," he said without turning around. Catherine always said sapphire was the most regal color. That it made a statement without apology. Erin moved to stand beside him, studying the portrait of the woman whose place she was taking. "Do you think she would approve? Of tonight? Of us?" "I think," John said slowly, "that Catherine would tell me to stop being such a coward and to kiss you already, before I ruin your carefully arranged hair with anxious fidgeting." Despite her nerves, Erin laughed. "I'm the one who's anxious. You've faced society 1,000 times. Not like this." He finally turned to look at her, and something in his expression stole her breath. "Not with everything I care about at stake. Not risking the woman I love to their judgment and cruelty." "Then don't." Erin took his hand, threading their fingers together. "Don't risk me. Let's cancel the ball. Announce that I've reconsidered, that the engagement is off, that—" "Erin Rivera," John interrupted, pulling her closer, "if you're about to suggest running away for the 3rd time in as many months, I may have to kiss you into submission. Promises, promises." He did kiss her then, thoroughly enough that her lady's maid would definitely need to fix her hair. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, John rested his forehead against hers. "We're going to walk into that ballroom together," he said firmly. "We're going to dance. We're going to smile and be gracious and show every judgmental gossip in London that we don't care what they think. And then, in 3 weeks' time, we're going to marry in the village church with Eloin as our witness, and society can hang itself." "Agreed. Agreed." Erin straightened his already perfect cravat. "Though I should warn you, I'm a terrible dancer. You'll probably regret that particular display of solidarity." "Impossible. I could never regret anything involving you." The ballroom at Montford House had been transformed. Thousands of candles cast golden light across polished marble floors. Flower arrangements, mostly roses, in honor of Catherine, who had loved them, adorned every surface. An orchestra tuned their instruments in the gallery. And in the entrance hall, 200 guests arrived in a steady stream of silk and jewels and thinly veiled curiosity. Erin stood beside John at the top of the grand staircase, watching the crowd gather below. She could feel their eyes on her, assessing, judging, whispering behind fans and gloved hands. The weight of their collective disapproval pressed down on her shoulders like a physical thing. "Smile," John murmured. "You look as though you're facing a firing squad." "Aren't I?" "No. You're facing a ballroom full of people who are about to discover that the Duke of Montford chose brilliantly, and that their opinions matter not at all." He offered her his arm. Ready? She wasn't. But she took his arm anyway. The crowd fell silent as they descended the staircase together. Erin could practically hear the mental calculations being made, taking in her gown, her posture, her very existence as John's intended. Searching for evidence of the scheming adventuress the papers had described. At the bottom of the stairs, Lady Hartwell stood waiting. Erin's stomach clenched, remembering their last encounter, Frederick's bleeding jaw, the bitter accusations. But the elderly woman surprised her. She executed a perfect curtsy, shallow enough to maintain her dignity, deep enough to show respect. "Miss Rivera," she said coolly. "You look well." It wasn't warm. It wasn't even particularly friendly. But it was civil, and from Lady Hartwell, that was tantamount to acceptance. "Thank you, Lady Hartwell." "As do you." "My nephew," Lady Hartwell continued, her gaze shifting to John, "has always been stubborn. Once he sets his mind to something, heaven and earth couldn't move him. I see that hasn't changed." "No, Aunt Margaret." "It hasn't." The older woman studied them both for a moment, then nodded sharply. "Well, the deed is done, the invitation sent. We might as well make the best of it." She gestured to the ballroom. "Shall we give them something to talk about?" It was as close to a blessing as Erin was likely to receive. The evening that followed was a blur of introductions, forced smiles, and polite conversations that barely masked the curiosity and judgment beneath. Some guests were kind, genuinely pleased to meet her, willing to give her the benefit of the doubt. Others were coldly civil, their disdain obvious in every clipped word and dismissive glance. And then there were the Duchess of Lennox and her daughter, Lady Margaret, who approached Erin during a brief moment when John was occupied with other guests. "So you're the famous governess," the Duchess said, her smile not reaching her eyes. "How enterprising of you to secure such an advantageous position." Erin felt her spine stiffen. "I fell in love, Your Grace." There was nothing enterprising about it. "Of course not," Lady Margaret agreed with false sweetness. "Though one must admit, it's quite the stroke of luck. From the servants' quarters to the Duchess's apartments. Most governesses aren't nearly so fortunate." "Most governesses," Erin said quietly, "spend their lives caring for other people's children, receiving little gratitude and less respect. If fortune has smiled on me, I'm grateful for it. But I didn't engineer it." "Didn't you?" The Duchess's smile sharpened. "The Duke is wealthy, grieving, vulnerable. His daughter desperately needed a mother. You must admit, the opportunity was rather perfectly suited to someone in your circumstances." Before Erin could respond, a familiar voice cut through the tension. "I believe, Your Grace, that you're speaking to my future stepmother." They all turned to find Lady Eloin standing there, resplendent in a white dress with blue ribbons that matched Erin's gown. She looked tiny and fierce, her chin lifted in perfect imitation of her father's aristocratic hauteur. "Lady Eloin," the Duchess said, clearly taken aback. "I didn't realize you were attending this evening. Papa said I could stay for 1 hour if I promised to be on my best behavior." Eloin moved to stand beside Erin, taking her hand. "And my best behavior includes defending Miss Erin when people are being unkind to her." "Unkind?" "My dear child, I was merely—" "You were suggesting she's a fortune hunter," Eloin interrupted with devastating directness. "I heard you. Everyone heard you. But you're wrong. Miss Erin didn't need to engineer anything, because Papa fell in love with her the first day she arrived. He told me so. He said she walked in during a storm and refused to be bullied, and he knew right then she was special. The Duchess's face flushed. Lady Eloin, I don't think. And she makes him laugh, Eloin continued relentlessly. She makes me laugh too. We sing songs about ducks and study butterflies, and she reads me stories with all the voices. The other governesses never did that. They were boring and mean, and they made me feel wrong. But Miss Erin makes me feel right. So if that's fortune hunting, then I hope she hunts all the fortune she wants. Erin's throat tightened with emotion. Lady Margaret looked mortified, and the Duchess was searching desperately for an exit. Well, the Duchess said stiffly. I see the child has been thoroughly influenced. Yes, came John's voice from behind them. He had appeared without anyone noticing, and his expression was glacial. My daughter has been influenced by kindness, affection, and genuine care. Terrible qualities in a future Duchess, I'm sure you'll agree. The Duchess and her daughter retreated hastily, and John knelt before Eloin, his eyes shining with pride and something else. Something that looked like tears. That, he said softly, was the bravest thing I've ever seen. I was practicing what Miss Erin taught me, Eloin said matter-of-factly. Standing up for people we love, even when it's scary. John looked up at Erin, and the love in his expression nearly undid her. It seems we're both learning from the best teacher. The rest of the evening passed more smoothly. Word of Eloin's fierce defense spread through the ballroom, embellished with each retelling, and the tone of the gathering shifted subtly. Perhaps a woman who could inspire such devotion from a child wasn't the calculating adventuress the papers had described. Perhaps there was more to this story than scandal. When John finally led Erin onto the dance floor for the first waltz, she was trembling, from exhaustion, from emotion, from the sheer weight of everything that had happened. You survived, he murmured as they moved together, his hand warm and steady at her waist. We survived, she corrected. All three of us. Yes. He pulled her slightly closer than was strictly proper. Though I'm fairly certain Eloin stole the show. Did you put her up to that speech? I had no idea she was even listening. I thought she was upstairs with her nurse. John laughed softly. She's your daughter through and through, appearing exactly when needed, saying exactly what needs to be said, regardless of propriety or consequence. Your daughter, Erin corrected. I'm just borrowing her. Our daughter, John said firmly. After the wedding, she'll be yours too. In every way that matters. 3 weeks later, they married in the village church just as John had promised. It was a small ceremony, intimate and perfect, with Eloin standing beside them in a dress she'd helped design, holding a bouquet of roses from Catherine's garden. The scandal never entirely died. There were always whispers, always judgment from those who believed a duke should have married within his sphere. But gradually, as the years passed and Erin proved herself a devoted wife and mother, a gracious hostess and charitable duchess, the whispers faded to background noise. And eventually, they stopped mattering at all. 10 years later. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the gardens of Montford House as Erin sat on a blanket beneath the oak tree, watching the chaos unfold before her. Lady Eloin, 16 now, tall and graceful and heartbreakingly beautiful, was teaching the younger children a modified version of the duck song. 7-year-old James, who had John's grey eyes and Erin's stubborn chin, was waddling in exaggerated circles. 5-year-old Catherine, named for the grandmother she would never meet, was conducting the performance with a stick she declared was a very important tiny scepter. And 3-year-old Thomas was mostly just running in circles, shrieking with laughter for no apparent reason. They're going to exhaust themselves, John observed, settling onto the blanket beside Erin and pulling her against his side. And then we'll pay for it at bedtime. Worth it, Erin said, resting her head on his shoulder. Look at them. Look at how happy they are. Like their mother. He pressed a kiss to her temple. Speaking of which, I received a letter from Lady Hartwell today. She's invited us, all of us, to spend Christmas at Hartwell Manor. Really? Erin turned to look at him in surprise. The last time we visited, she spent 3 days correcting Catherine's table manners. She's gotten softer in her old age. And I think she actually enjoys the chaos now, though she'd never admit it. John's smile was warm. Besides, she specifically mentioned that she wants to hear James's latest composition. Apparently his letters about music theory have impressed her. He gets that from you. The discipline, the precision, and the passion from you. John traced lazy patterns on her arm. Everything good in our children comes from you, Erin. That's not true. It is, though. He shifted to look at her properly, and the love in his eyes after 10 years of marriage still made her breath catch. You taught us, that it's safe to be happy. To laugh and play and love without fear. To risk everything for what matters most. Erin thought about the woman who had arrived at Montford House during a storm, desperate and alone, terrified of the future. She thought about the frozen Duke who had tried to turn his daughter into a perfect automaton. And she thought about the journey that had brought them here, to this garden, this family, this life they'd built together. Do you ever regret it? She asked softly. The scandal? The judgment? Marrying so far beneath your station? John laughed, the sound warm and genuine. Never. Though I do sometimes regret not kissing you sooner. We wasted at least 3 weeks on propriety and fear. Only 3 weeks. Possibly 4. He cupped her face in his hand, his thumb brushing her cheek. I love you, Erin Coon, Duchess of Montford. I loved you when you were a governess in a borrowed dress with a puddle at your feet. I loved you when society called you a fortune hunter. I loved you when you threatened to leave me for my own good. And I'll love you 50 years from now when we're old and grey and our children are teaching their children ridiculous songs about ducks. Erin's eyes filled with tears, happy ones, the kind she'd learned to embrace rather than hide. I love you too. Even when you're being impossibly romantic and making me cry in the garden where the children can see. Papa's making Mama cry again. James announced, looking up from his waddling. Should we intervene? Only if they're the sad tears, Eloin called back, laughing. If they're the happy crying tears, we leave them alone. How can you tell the difference? Catherine demanded. The happy ones come with kissing. And indeed, John was already leaning in, his lips finding Erin's in a kiss that tasted of love and laughter and a decade of choosing each other, every single day. Definitely happy tears, Thomas declared solemnly, then went back to his aimless running. Later, after the children had been herded inside for supper, still singing, still waddling, still radiating joy, Erin and John remained in the garden as twilight fell. They sat together beneath the oak tree, her head on his shoulder, his arm around her waist, watching the stars begin to appear. Do you think she'd be proud? Erin asked quietly. Catherine? Of what we've built here? John was silent for a moment, considering. Then he pointed toward the house, where light spilled from the nursery windows and the sound of children's laughter drifted out into the evening air. I think, he said slowly, that she would say we did exactly what she asked. We took care of Eloin. We made sure she was happy. We didn't let grief consume us. He turned to kiss Erin's forehead. And I think she would be grateful that her daughter, our daughter, got to grow up in a house full of love and laughter and ridiculous songs about ducks. Even if one of those ducks was quite quackers. Erin laughed, the sound echoing across the gardens of Montford House, a house that was no longer a mausoleum but a home. A house filled with children and chaos and the kind of messy, imperfect, beautiful love that made life worth living. Quite quackers indeed, she agreed, snuggling closer against her husband's side as the stars came out overhead. And in the distance, if you listened carefully, you could almost hear the echo of other laughter, lighter, more ethereal, as though someone who had once filled these gardens with joy was pleased to hear them filled with joy again.